blood was already dry by the time anyone found the tracks. They were not small tracks. Each impression in the frozen mud was wider than a grown man's hand, pressed so deep that the edges had cracked outward like something enormous had landed there and refused to leave. The tracks led from the edge of the tree line, across a narrow clearing, and stopped at the bank of a creek that was half frozen and moving fast underneath. Whatever had made them had stood at that bank for a long time, long enough for the mud around the tracks to settle, to harden slightly, to record every shift of weight. Then the tracks turned back into the forest and disappeared. Owen Marsh found them on a Tuesday morning in late October, and his first thought was not excitement, it was dread. Owen had worked as a wildlife ranger in the northern region of Montana for 11 years. He was 38 years old, lean from walking in all weather, and careful, in the way that men who work alone in big country learn to be careful. He crouched over the tracks with his coffee thermos still in his hand, and studied them for a long time without speaking, because there was no one to speak to. He had learned to think out loud only in his truck, and this morning he was a mile from his truck. He already knew what animal had made these tracks. He had seen them before, twice, over the last 4 years. Both times he had told his supervisor, and both times the file had been noted and set aside. There were bigger problems in the region than one solitary wolf no one could catch. The wolf's official designation was M21. The researchers who had first tagged him years ago had given him that name the way you name a filing cabinet, not the way you name something you expect to still be thinking about a decade later. He was male, estimated to be around 3 years old at the time of first documentation, and he had survived an injury serious enough that most biologists who reviewed the case thought he would be dead within a season. He was not dead. He was leaving tracks the size of dinner plates at Owen's favorite morning creek, and Owen stood up slowly, screwed the lid back on his thermos, and decided to do something he almost never did. He decided to follow. The forest in that part of Montana in late October is a specific kind of quiet. The tourist season is over. The hunting season has not yet peaked. The trees are mostly conifer, and they hold their needles through the cold, so the canopy stays thick even when the undergrowth has gone brown and flat. Sound travels strangely in that quiet. A branch snapped 50 yards away sounds like it is right behind you, and the creak sound carries further than it should. Owen walked carefully, his boots placed with attention, his eyes moving between the ground and the middle distance, the way experienced trackers learn to do. Because you lose the trail if you only look down, and you lose yourself if you only look ahead. He followed M21's tracks for 40 minutes before he stopped. Not because the tracks ended, because he suddenly understood something he had not understood when he started following. The wolf was not running. The tracks showed a walk, heavy on the right front foot and lighter on the left, compensating. The gait was deliberate. The wolf had not been fleeing anything or chasing anything. He had been walking, in the specific unhurried way of an animal that knows its territory so completely that it no longer needs to pay full attention to the ground. These were the tracks of an animal that had been here, in this forest, for years. Not passing through, living. Owen stood in the cold and breathed out slowly, and watched the vapor from his breath drift up into the needles above him. He thought about the file on M21. He thought about the veterinarians who had tried to reach him. He thought about what it meant that an animal with a bad leg and 9 years of solitude behind him still walked his territory with that kind of confidence. Then he heard something he did not expect to hear. Not a growl, not a snap of brush, something quieter. A sound between a breath and a sigh, low and rough, coming from somewhere to his left, where the trees were thicker and the light was not reaching the ground well. Owen went very still. He did not turn his head quickly. He turned it the way you turn a dial when you do not want to make noise, degree by degree, until he was looking at the spot where the sound had come from. M21 was standing between 2 pines about 30 feet away, looking directly at him. Owen had seen wolves before. He had been close to wolves before, in the course of his work. But he had never been looked at quite like this. The wolf was not threatening him. He was not crouching or showing his teeth. He was standing upright and still, his coat thick and gray with a darker line running along his spine, his left front leg set slightly differently than the right, and his amber eyes fixed on Owen, with an expression that Owen could only describe later, to his supervisor, as assessment. The wolf was deciding something. Owen did not move. He barely breathed. He had enough experience to know that movement right now would end whatever this moment was, and whatever this moment was, it felt significant in a way he could not explain. They looked at each other for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. Owen could not have said. Then M21 turned his head, looked at some point in the forest to the east, and walked away without hurry, his crooked leg giving his gait a slight roll that would have looked awkward on any other animal, and looked, on him, simply like his own particular way of moving through the world. Owen exhaled. He stood in the trees for another 5 minutes without moving. Then he walked back to his truck, drove to the regional station, and wrote the most detailed incident report he had filed in years. The supervisor read it. Then she picked up the phone and called Dr. Carla Reyes. Carla Reyes was 51 years old and had spent the better part of 2 decades studying wolf behavior in the northern Rockies. She was not dramatic about her work. She spoke in short sentences, dressed in practical layers, and had a habit of going silent in the middle of conversations when she was thinking, which unnerved people who did not know her, and which people who did know her had learned to simply wait out. She had written 3 papers on M21 without ever having been able to get within 300 meters of him. She had a thick file on his behavior, built from camera traps, aerial surveys, and the accounts of rangers like Owen who occasionally crossed his path. She knew more about him than almost anyone alive, and she had never touched him, never spoken to him at close range, never confirmed any of her hypotheses in person. He was the one subject in her career that had remained entirely out of reach. When she got the call about Owen's morning, she drove out the same afternoon. She stood at the creek bank and looked at the tracks in the mud and said nothing for a long time. Then she looked at the tree line and said quietly, to no one in particular, "He is letting himself be seen." Owen, standing beside her, said, "Is that new?" She said, "For him, yes." What Carla knew about M21, that the general file did not fully capture, was this. He had not always been alone. In his earliest documented period, when he was first tagged, he had been part of a small pack in the eastern section of the range. The pack had been disrupted by a combination of territory pressure, from a larger group moving in from the north, and a hard winter that reduced prey numbers significantly. 2 members of M21's pack had not survived that winter, the others had dispersed. M21 had remained. The injury had come the following spring, during what appeared from the evidence to be a territorial confrontation with the dominant male of the pack that had moved in. M21 had lost that confrontation badly. The gash along his left side had been documented from aerial survey photos, a long, diagonal tear that had become infected and then, slowly, healed. The front paw damage was harder to explain from photos alone. The best guess was that it had been stepped on or pinned during the same confrontation, breaking something in the small bones that set wrong as it healed. What the injury had done to him physically was visible. What it had done to him behaviorally was more complicated. He had refused every healer, not from stupidity, from precision. Every attempt at tranquilization or capture had failed because M21 responded to the presence of people moving with purpose in his direction with a level of awareness that was almost preternatural. He could tell the difference, somehow, between a ranger walking a trail and a team moving toward him with intention. He responded to the latter by disappearing, in a way that seemed impossible for an animal his size with his limp. Teams with tracking equipment had lost him repeatedly. One team, using a dart rifle from a significant distance, had gotten close enough to attempt a shot, and M21 had moved at the exact moment the dart fired, as if he had heard it or sensed it in some way that none of the researchers could fully account for. The dart had struck a tree. M21 had not been seen in that sector for 4 months. The consensus, as Carla had noted in her second paper, was not that M21 was aggressive. It was that he was private in a way that had become absolute. The injury had not broken him. It had refined him down to something essential. He lived, he moved, he maintained his territory, and he allowed no one close enough to interfere with any of that. And now he had stood 30 feet from Owen Marsh and looked at him. Carla drove back to the station that evening and sat at the small table in the break room with her file and a cup of tea that went cold while she read. She had been through this file so many times that she could recite sections of it. But she read it again now, with Owen's account in mind, looking for something she might have missed. Some thread, some pattern in M21's behavior that explained why he would stand and look at a ranger he had never been close to before. She did not find a clear answer that night, but she noticed something she had noticed before, and not given enough weight. M21 had never, in 9 years, injured a person. He had avoided them, frightened them, made attempts at approach impossible, but he had never charged, never bitten, never done anything that the official documentation would have to classify as aggression toward humans. He was not keeping people away because he wanted to destroy them. He was keeping them away because he had decided, with the logic available to him, that letting them close would cost him something he was not willing to pay. Owen drove home that night on the long straight road through the valley, and thought about what Carla had said at the creek bank. He is letting himself be seen. Owen had been a ranger for 11 years, and had worked with researchers enough to know that scientists were careful with language, that they did not usually say things like, letting himself be seen, because it implied intention, and intention was something you could not prove about an animal, without a long argument about methodology. Carla had said it anyway. She had said it quietly, almost to herself, as if she was not making a claim but simply recording something she had observed. He is letting himself be seen. Owen drove through the dark valley and thought about an animal that had spent 9 years in perfect solitude, and he thought about what might make such an animal suddenly stand in the open and hold still. He did not have an answer, but the question stayed with him the whole drive home, and was still there when he went to bed, and it was still there in the morning, when he woke up, and looked out his window at the mountains, and thought about what was living in them, alone and deliberate and still, after all this time. The cold that came down from the north that November was the kind that settled in and did not move, not the dramatic cold of a proper winter storm, where the snow comes sideways and the temperature drops so fast you can feel it hit like a wall. This was quieter than that. It came in overnight, gradually, the way something permanent arrives, without announcement, without drama, simply there, when you woke up and looked at the thermometer, and understood that the warmth was gone, and would not be back for months. The creek where Owen had found the tracks froze from the edges, inward, over the course of a week. The mud on the bank that had held the impression of M21's paws went hard, and then was covered by snow, and then the snow packed down, and the impressions were gone, but Owen knew they were still there underneath, preserved in the frozen mud like a cast. He went back to the creek 3 more times that month. He did not see M21 again, but the camera he mounted in a pine tree overlooking the bank told him, when he reviewed the footage each week, that M21 was still coming, always at night, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the temperature was at its lowest. Standing at the creek bank, looking at the water under the ice, sometimes drinking from a spot near the center where the current kept a small section open, and once, on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week of November, standing at the bank and looking directly at the camera for 4.5 minutes without moving. Owen showed that footage to Carla when she came back to the station in December. She watched it 3 times. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling, and was silent for long enough that Owen got up and refilled his coffee and sat back down before she spoke. She said, "He knows the camera is there." Owen said, "I figured." She said, "He's looking at it anyway." That was all she said about it, but Owen noticed that she added a note to the file that afternoon, and when he glanced at what she had written, it said simply, "Subject demonstrates awareness of observation and does not withdraw. This is new." December brought more snow and shorter days, and the particular silence of a mountain winter that people who have not experienced it sometimes romanticize, and people who live in it understand as something more complicated than romantic. It is a silence that requires you to be comfortable in yourself, because there is nothing to fill it from the outside. Owen was comfortable in it. He had been comfortable in it for years. He drove his routes, checked his cameras, filed his reports, and once a week called his sister in Billings who worried about him living alone out there in the snow, and he told her he was fine, which was true, and that he liked it, which was also true, and she believed him, but worried anyway, which was her right. It was on one of his weekly camera checks, in the 2nd week of December, that he found something that made him stop his truck in the middle of the road, and sit with the engine running and the heater on, and look at the photograph on the small screen of his camera reader, for a very long time. The photograph was from the camera on the creek bank. It had been taken at 3 in the morning, 2 days earlier, in the deep cold when the temperature had dropped to -14. The creek was fully frozen now. The snow on the bank was undisturbed, except for one set of tracks leading to the bank and one set leading away. And in the middle of the photograph, standing at the bank in the dark with his coat thick against the cold and his amber eyes catching the infrared flash of the camera as a pale, eerie shine, was M21. He was not alone. Pressed against his right side, close enough that you could see where the fur of two animals met, was something smaller. A fox, young by the look of it, female, her red coat dark in the infrared light, her eyes catching the flash the same way his did. She was standing against him with the unself-conscious ease of an animal that has decided something is safe and no longer thinks about whether the decision was correct. And M21 was standing completely still, his weight on his good leg, his crooked left paw lifted slightly off the snow, not moving away, not looking at her, looking at the camera with those pale, caught eyes. Owen sat in his truck in the road and looked at that photograph for a long time. He thought about what Carla had said. He is letting himself be seen. He thought about 9 years of solitude. He thought about an animal that had refused every approach, outmaneuvered every team, disappeared from every attempt to reach him. He thought about what it meant that this same animal was standing at a frozen creek at 3 in the morning, in -14 degrees, with a fox pressed against his side, and his eyes on a camera he absolutely knew was there. He drove the rest of his route, and then drove back to the station, and called Carla, and told her what the camera had shown him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send me the photograph." He sent it. He waited. She called back 12 minutes later, and her voice was different from her usual careful, even tone. It was not excited, exactly. But it was changed. She said, "Owen, something is shifting with him. I don't know what yet, but something is shifting." Owen looked out the station window at the snow falling in the parking lot lights, soft and steady and indifferent to everything happening under it. He thought about M21, standing at that frozen creek in the deep of the night, warm from his own biology, pressed by a small fox who had made a decision, and looking directly at the eye of a camera that would carry his image back to the people he had spent 9 years refusing. He said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "Nothing yet, we watch." And so they watched. Through December and into January, the cameras watched, and Owen walked his routes, and M21 moved through his territory the way he always had, and the only thing that changed was this. He kept coming back to the creek bank. Night after night, in whatever the weather brought, he came back. Sometimes the fox was with him, sometimes he was alone, and every time the camera caught him, he was looking at it, not past it, at it. With those amber eyes that the infrared made pale and strange, and somehow very direct, as if he was trying to communicate something across the gap between what he was and what the camera represented, across the gap between the wild and the watching, across 9 years of chosen distance. Owen filed his reports. Carla updated her file. And somewhere in the snow-covered forest to the east of the creek, something in M21 that had been closed for a very long time was, slowly, and without hurry, beginning to consider opening. The first time a veterinarian had tried to reach M21, the wolf had been 2 years out from his injury, and the infection in the wound along his side had been visible from aerial photographs. Not clearly, not with certainty, but enough that the Regional Wildlife Authority had authorized an intervention attempt. The vet assigned to the attempt was a man named Philip Crane, and he had been working with large predators for 15 years and had never failed to complete an assessment on an animal he had been sent to assess. He said this with the quiet confidence of someone who has earned it, and the team assigned to assist him believed it, and they went out into M21's territory on a clear October morning with the right equipment and the right plan. On the 4th day, the camera traps they had placed showed him passing through a corridor half a mile from their position at midnight. Philip revised the plan. On the 5th day, they repositioned. On the 6th day, the cameras showed M21 had stopped using that corridor entirely and had shifted his movement pattern to a section of the territory they had not covered. On the 7th day, Philip called the regional authority and said they needed more time. The authority gave them 3 more days. At the end of those 3 days, they had not laid eyes on the wolf at any point during the entire attempt. Philip Crane filed a report that was thorough and honest and said, in its conclusion, that M21 appeared to respond to the presence of purposeful human movement in his territory, with a level of behavioral adjustment that made conventional capture or assessment attempts non-viable. He recommended remote monitoring and a waiting period. The authority accepted the recommendation. The team went home. 2 years later, A different vet tried. Her name was Grace Holloway, and she was younger than Philip and more willing to sit quietly for long periods in the cold, which she believed was the key skill everyone else had been skipping. She set up a blind near one of M21's regular movement paths and sat in it for 9 days straight, camping nearby, barely moving during the hours when the cameras showed him most active. She heard him once. She smelled him once. That dense, wild smell of large predator that is nothing like a domestic dog, and which, she said later, made every hair on her arms stand up, even through her layers. She never saw him. On the 10th day, the cameras showed he had simply rerouted around her blind by 300 meters, cleanly, without appearing to hurry, as if the adjustment was a minor inconvenience rather than a significant change to his established pattern. Grace also filed an honest report. She said, "This animal is not afraid of people. He is making deliberate choices to avoid people who are making deliberate choices to approach him. The distinction matters." No one sent a third vet immediately after Grace. The regional authority was managing a complicated season, and M21 was not a priority in the way that a wolf causing livestock problems would have been. He was a solitary animal in a remote section of territory, not bothering anyone, apparently surviving despite his injury. The file was noted and set aside. But Carla Reyes was reading the files. She had been reading the files on M21 since his first documentation, long before she became the lead researcher on the study that eventually put her name on the papers about him. She had requested access to Philip's report, and to Grace's report, and to the aerial survey data, and to the camera trap records, and she had built her own parallel understanding of this animal that was more detailed than what any single file contained. What Carla understood, that the individual reports touched on, but did not fully articulate, was that M21's avoidance was not random, and not reflexive. It was calibrated. He did not avoid everything. He moved through a landscape that contained roads and fences, and the distant sounds of human activity, without apparent distress. He had been photographed by camera traps dozens of times, which meant he either did not notice the cameras, or did not care about them. He had crossed within sight of at least 3 different rangers over the years, including Owen, and had not fled in panic. What he avoided was specific. He avoided people who were coming for him. People who were moving through his territory with intention directed at him. How he detected that intention was the question Carla could not answer with certainty. She had theories. Smell was the obvious one. People moving with purpose carry the elevated chemistry of stress and focus, and a wolf's nose is sophisticated enough to detect things that no human instrument has yet been built to measure. But she also thought it was behavioral. People who are trying to approach a specific animal move differently than people who are walking through the landscape for other reasons. The quality of attention is different. The pattern of pause and direction is different. M21 had likely learned, through years of experience, to read that difference, the way a very observant person learns to read the difference between someone who is walking toward them by coincidence and someone who is walking toward them with a specific purpose. He had been taught by 9 years of attempts to recognize the posture of intention, and he had been taught by the same 9 years that the right response to that posture was to become invisible. Carla laid all of this out in a paper she published in the 3rd year of her study, and it was read by people in her field and discussed at a conference in Bozeman, where several researchers noted that what she was describing sounded less like standard wolf behavior and more like something that required a word usually reserved for describing people: wisdom. Carla had presented that section of her findings carefully, using language that kept the framing within acceptable scientific bounds, but privately she agreed with the word. What M21 had developed over 9 years of surviving alone with a bad leg in contested territory was something that looked, from every angle she examined it from, like earned wisdom about the nature of people and what they wanted and how to stay out of their reach, which made what was happening at the creek bank in December and January so remarkable. Because what was happening at the creek bank looked, from every angle, like M21 choosing to be reachable, not by anyone who came with purpose, not yet, and perhaps not ever, but by the camera, by the eye that watched but did not move, by the record that accumulated without agenda. He kept coming back to the camera, every night, almost without exception, and Carla, watching the footage Owen sent her weekly, watching the pale infrared eyes looking directly into the lens night after night, began to feel something she was careful not to put in her scientific notes, but which she acknowledged to herself plainly. M21 was communicating, not in any language she could translate, but in the plain fact of his presence, repeated, deliberate, directed at the one thing in his territory that watched him without trying to approach him. "I am here," he seemed to be saying, to the eye that had no hands and no tranquilizer and no intent. "I am here. I am watching you watch me. I have been here a long time." The fox appeared in the footage 6 more times over those 2 months. Carla noted her with interest. A fox choosing to stand near a wolf was unusual enough to warrant documentation. A fox choosing to press against a wolf in cold temperatures suggested something that had developed over more than one encounter, a familiarity that implied this was not the first time they had shared space. Wolves and foxes occupied overlapping territories and were not naturally friendly, but they were not always hostile either. A lone wolf with no pack and no immediate territorial conflict might occasionally tolerate a fox that was not competing for the same prey. What made it interesting was M21's response to her, which was nothing. No acknowledgement, no shift of posture, no look in her direction when she appeared. He simply allowed her to be there, which was, Carla thought, its own kind of statement. He allowed small presences that arrived without agenda. The fox had not approached him with purpose. She had simply appeared in the same space, and he had not ended that. And so she had kept appearing, and somewhere in that simple sequence, something had settled between them that neither of them had needed to announce. Owen drove his routes through January, and thought about this. He was not a researcher. He did not have the vocabulary Carla used in her papers, and he had never tried to build one. But he had worked in this landscape for 11 years, and he had developed, the way anyone who works long enough in a specific environment develops, a kind of attentiveness to pattern that did not require formal language to function. He could feel when something in the landscape had changed, before he could name what it was. Something in M21's territory had changed. He could not have said exactly what it was, if someone had asked him to be precise. The wolf was moving the same routes. The camera footage showed the same behavior in the same locations. Nothing obvious had shifted. But Owen had the feeling, persistent and specific, that the perimeter M21 had maintained for 9 years had become slightly more permeable. Not open, not even close to open, but less absolute than it had been. Like a door that had always been locked and had not been unlocked, but had, perhaps, been thought about. From the inside. He mentioned this to Carla in the 3rd week of January, standing in the station parking lot in the cold, because he had come to hand-deliver a memory card from the creek camera, and she had driven up from Missoula for it. She listened to him without interrupting, which was one of the things Owen appreciated about her. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think you're right. I don't know what it means yet." He said, "Should we do anything?" She said, "We wait." He nodded. That was the answer he had expected. It was, he believed, also the correct answer. Whatever was happening with M21 was happening on M21's timeline. The one lesson 9 years of failed attempts had made perfectly clear was that trying to speed up that timeline accomplished exactly nothing, except confirming to the wolf that the people trying were exactly the kind of people he was right to avoid. You waited. You watched. You let him come at his own pace, if he came at all. Owen drove home in the January dark, with his headlights cutting through snow that had started falling again, soft and heavy, the kind that would cover everything by morning, and he thought about patience. He thought about what it cost to wait for something that might not come. He thought about M21, standing at the frozen creek night after night, looking at a camera, neither closing the distance nor increasing it, holding his position, making no sudden moves. Owen understood that. More than he would have expected to, more than he would have been comfortable saying out loud to anyone except maybe Carla. He understood the particular discipline of holding still when something in you wanted to move, of staying where you were, and letting the world come to you, or not come to you, and accepting that you did not get to decide which it was. He drove through the snow and the mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, and somewhere up in them, a gray wolf with a crooked leg was walking his territory in the quiet of the night, and Owen was oddly at peace with all of it, with the not knowing and the waiting, and the slow, careful possibility of something that had not yet declared what it was. He turned off the main road toward his house, and the headlights swept across the bare trees at the edge of his property, and for just a moment, in the peripheral edge of the light, he thought he saw something move. He stopped the truck. He sat very still. He looked at the trees. There was nothing there. just the falling snow and the dark shapes of the branches and the small sounds of the night settling into itself. He drove the rest of the way to his house and parked and went inside. But he stood at his kitchen window for a few minutes before he turned the light on, looking out at the trees, and he thought, "You're out there, aren't you? Moving through all of it like you own it. Because you do. You have. For 9 years. He turned on the light. The kitchen was warm and familiar and his own. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything evenly, the way it always did, indifferent to whatever was underneath it. She had not meant to be there. That was the part that Nadia Vasquez kept coming back to, later, when people asked her to explain it. She had not planned any of what happened. She had not come to that corner of Montana as a researcher, or a volunteer, or a person with any ambition toward the wild. She had come to disappear, and disappearing was the only plan she had. The apartment in Denver had become impossible to stay in. She had tried. She had changed the locks twice, and bought heavier curtains, and stopped posting anything public online. And for a few weeks, that had felt like enough. Then it had not felt like enough. The situation that had made her apartment feel unsafe is not one she ever spoke about in detail to anyone she did not trust completely, and she did not trust people easily, which had always been true about her and had become more true in the year before she left Denver. She was 34 years old. She had spent 6 years before that working as a field medic in difficult environments, which had given her a high tolerance for physical difficulty and a low tolerance for the kind of fear that followed you inside, that was waiting when you got home, that made ordinary things feel unsafe in ways she could not fully explain to anyone who had not experienced it. A colleague from her time in the field, a woman named Diane Abbott who had moved to Missoula and was working in conservation, offered the cabin. It belonged to a research organization that used it seasonally and left it empty in the winter. It was small, and it was remote, and it had enough propane for heating, and a wood stove as backup, and a generator for the essential things, and a road that was difficult to navigate in heavy snow, which was, in January, an asset. Diane said, "Go there. Stay as long as you need. Tell no one." Nadia took 2 cameras, one for wide shots and one for close work, both of which she carried the way other people carry books, not because she was planning to use them, but because they were what she knew how to hold. She took warm clothes and enough food for 6 weeks, and a few things that mattered to her personally, which she put in the bottom of a bag without thinking much about it. She drove north and then west and then north again, and the landscape changed around her, the way landscapes do when you drive long enough, cities to towns to open country, and somewhere in that transition, something in her chest unclenched slightly, not enough to call relief, but enough to feel different from how it had felt in the apartment. The cabin was exactly what Diane had described: small, clean, cold when she arrived, warm once she had the stove going, 1 main room, 1 small bedroom, a kitchen that had everything essential and nothing extra, a porch with a view of a tree line about 40 yards back, beyond which the forest went on for a long time. She stood on the porch that first evening after she had unloaded the truck and looked at the tree line in the failing light, and did not feel anything dramatic. She felt tired. She felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has not slept properly in weeks. She went inside and ate something simple and went to bed before 8 and did not dream. She slept for 11 hours. When she woke up it was light, and the forest was still there, and nothing had moved in the night, except the snow, which had added another inch to what was already on the ground. She made coffee and stood at the window and looked at the tree line and thought, "Good. This is good." She did not intend to photograph wildlife. Her cameras were there out of habit, the same way a carpenter might bring his tools to a place he was going to live, even if he had no plans to build anything. She had used them for years to document things she saw in the field, and the gesture of putting them in the bag had been automatic, not strategic. The second day at the cabin, she took them out and checked the batteries and put them on the small table by the window, because they were equipment, and equipment should be ready, even if you did not know what you were going to use it for. On the 4th day, she took the wide-angle camera out onto the porch and photographed the tree line at sunrise, because the light was doing something specific with the frost on the pine needles that she had not seen before, and the image, when she reviewed it that evening, was the first thing in months that made her feel something that was not fear or exhaustion. It was small and quiet, that feeling, but it was there. She began to walk. Not every day at first, and not far. She stayed within a comfortable distance of the cabin, on the flat ground near the tree line, because the snow was deep enough in other areas that walking was hard work, and she was not trying to push herself. She was trying to do nothing, which turned out to be more difficult than it sounded. Her body had been operating at a high level of alertness for long enough that it did not easily downshift. She startled at sounds she knew were harmless. She woke in the night sometimes and lay in the dark listening for a few minutes, before she could place herself and remember where she was, and confirm that the sounds were the cabin settling in the cold, or the wind in the trees, or an animal moving somewhere outside, the normal small movements of a living landscape, doing what living landscapes do. She walked in the mornings before the light was fully up, which was when the cold was deepest, but also when the forest was at its most specific. She had learned that in her field years, the early morning is when you see what is actually there, before the day warms, and movement becomes more general and harder to read. She carried the wide-angle camera, and she photographed what she saw, which in the first 2 weeks was mostly light on snow, and birds, and the tracks of small animals, rabbits, squirrels, the delicate pattern of a fox passing through the open area near the cabin overnight. She photographed everything without agenda, which she discovered was the only way she knew how to be useful to herself right now. Not making plans, just recording what was there. She had been at the cabin for 3 weeks and 2 days when she first saw M21, and she did not know who he was. She was walking her morning route, the path that followed the tree line west, and then curved back through a section where the trees were not as dense, and the light came down clearly in the mornings. She had the camera up looking at a patch of ice crystals on a low branch, when her eye caught movement at the left edge of her vision, and she lowered the camera and looked. He was between the trees, about 50 meters away, gray, very large, standing completely still. Her first reaction was not fear. Her first reaction was something closer to recognition, the feeling of encountering something that belongs exactly where it is. She had seen wolves at a distance in other environments, years ago, and she recognized the shape and the stillness. This one was watching her. She was watching him. The morning was very quiet. She did not raise the camera. She did not know why, exactly. Something about raising the camera felt like it would break whatever this was, and she did not want to break it. She stood where she was and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved for what might have been a minute or a minute and a half. Then he simply turned and walked into the trees and was gone, and the forest closed behind him, as if he had never been there, except that she had seen him, and the morning now had a different weight to it. She walked back to the cabin, and sat with her coffee, and thought about what she had seen. She did not feel afraid. That was the specific thing she noted, because fear had been her default setting for months, and she had become used to cataloging its presence or absence as a way of orienting herself. She had seen a very large wild predator, at relatively close range, and she had felt interested, alert, present in a way she had not felt in longer than she could precisely remember. She called Diane that evening, not because she needed to, but because Diane was the one person she had agreed to check in with weekly, and the week was up. She described what she had seen, and Diane immediately said, "That sounds like it might be M21. Do you have a signal there? Look up M21 Montana wolves." She looked it up that evening on her phone, reading by the light of the wood stove. She read Philip Crane's report, which was publicly available in summarized form. She read the summary of Grace Holloway's attempt. She found a reference to Carla Reyes's paper, which she could not access the full text of from her phone, but which the summary described as documenting a wolf that had refused human contact for 9 years and showed unusual behavioral sophistication in detecting and avoiding purposeful human approach. She set her phone down and looked at the stove and thought about what she had just read. 9 years, alone, refusing everyone. And he had stood in the trees this morning and looked at her, and she had looked back, and neither of them had done anything to break it. She did not try to find out who Owen Marsh was that night. She did not call the regional wildlife station. She was not a researcher, and she had no standing to contact researchers, and frankly, she was not yet sure enough of what she had seen to characterize it as significant. She had seen a wolf. A large, solitary wolf, who had stood still and looked at her. That was all. It might not mean anything. But she went to bed that night with the particular aliveness that comes from a genuine encounter with something real and unmanaged, and she slept without waking, and in the morning when she went out on her walk she walked the same route, and she looked at the tree line without trying to look, and she thought, if you are there, you will show me. If you are not, you will not. Either is fine. She walked the full route and saw nothing. She drank her coffee on the porch and watched a raven land in the near pines and leave again, and thought about a wolf who had refused 11 veterinarians over 9 years, and she thought about what it was like to refuse people for a long time, because you had decided, correctly or not, that letting them close would cost you something you could not afford to pay. She understood that. More than she would have expected to, she understood it. She went inside and picked up the wide-angle camera and looked at the images from the previous mornings, and then she looked at the image she had not taken, the one that existed only in her memory, a gray wolf in the trees at 50 meters, perfectly still, looking at her in the clear, cold morning light with amber eyes that held no particular emotion she could name, but held something. Attention, presence, the full weight of a living thing deciding, in its own time, in its own way, what it was going to do. She thought, I am going to see you again. She did not say it to anything or anyone. She thought it in the quiet cabin in the early morning, with the stove ticking as the wood shifted. And then she got up and washed her cup and started making plans for the day, which was the first time in longer than she could count that making plans for a day had felt like anything other than a form of managing fear. Outside, the snow that had fallen in the night was fresh and unmarked. She looked at it through the window. She looked at the tree line. She looked at the place where she had seen him yesterday, the gap between 2 pines, where the light came through differently than anywhere else. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put on her layers and picked up her camera and went out into the cold morning to see what was there. She had been at the cabin for exactly 41 days. She knew this because she had started, somewhere in the 3rd week, keeping a simple count in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. Not a journal, not notes on anything in particular, just a number at the top of each page, written when she woke up, to anchor herself in time, in a place where the days could otherwise blur together, in the sameness of cold and light and walking. On day 41 she was on her morning route, the western path that curved through the gap in the pines, and she came around the bend in the path where the trees opened up slightly, and the light was always good at this hour, and M21 was standing in the path ahead of her. Not in the trees, not at 50 meters. In the path, 25 feet away. She stopped. He had not run. He had not moved. He was standing in the center of the path with his weight distributed in the way she had come to recognize, across a month of distance glimpses, heavier on the right, the left front leg placed carefully, but not bearing full weight. His coat in the morning light was extraordinary, the gray having more variation in it than you could see at distance, darker along the spine and lighter at the chest, and the scar on his left flank was visible as a slightly different texture, where the fur grew back differently over the healed tissue. His eyes were amber and direct, and they were on her face. She did not do what training said to do. She did not make herself large. She did not back away slowly. She did not make noise to appear intimidating. She sat down in the snow. She said later, to Diane, and later still to Carla, that it was not a decision in the way that most decisions are. It was more like the absence of other decisions. She was tired. She had been tired for months. She was tired of managing her presence in the world, of calculating how to be, of performing safety for things and people and situations. And here was this wolf, at 25 feet, who had decided, for reasons she did not understand and was not going to interrogate, to stand in her path on a Tuesday morning. And something in her simply put her down in the snow and said, "We are both just here. That is all this needs to be." She sat in the snow, and the cold came up through her layers from the ground, and she stayed still, and looked at him, and he stayed still, and looked at her. He did not come closer. He did not leave. He stood in the path and she sat in the snow, and they held that arrangement for what she later estimated, checking the timestamp on a photograph she took with a shaking hand about 15 minutes in, was 23 minutes. Then he turned his head and looked at something in the forest to the east, seemed to consider it for a moment, and walked off the path into the trees, and was gone. She sat in the snow for another 5 minutes. She was not sure her legs would work properly if she tried to stand up immediately. When she did stand up, they worked fine, but she stood still for a moment, with the cold and the quiet, and the smell of pine, and the specific texture of the air in that spot, and she thought, "This is the most real thing that has happened to me in a long time." She walked back to the cabin and did not call anyone. She made coffee, and sat at the table and looked at the photograph she had taken, which was blurred because her hand had not been steady, and which showed, if you knew what you were looking at, a large gray shape in a clearing at a moderate distance. She had taken it because her hands had moved on their own, camera raising to face out of long habit, and then she had put the camera down because pointing it directly at him felt like a violation of something. The photograph existed as proof, not as art. It was ugly and imprecise, and she would not have printed it for anything, but she was glad she had taken it. She thought about day 41. She thought about 23 minutes in the snow. She thought about an animal that had refused contact with 11 professionals who came with training and equipment and good intentions, standing perfectly still in the path of a woman who had come here to hide from her own life and had no particular qualification for any of this. She wrote the number 41 in her notebook, and underneath it, she wrote, "He was in the path. He stood still. I sat down. He stayed for almost 25 minutes. Then she looked at what she had written, and wrote one more line. I don't know what I did right. Maybe nothing. Maybe that was the point." She went out on the path again the next morning. He was not there. Or if he was in the trees, and choosing not to show himself. She walked her full route in the cold, and came back and did the things that filled her days, reading, tending the stove, eating, maintaining the small routines that were keeping her organized in a place that had no external structure to impose organization. She had, in the weeks at the cabin, developed what she could only call a practice of noticing. This was not a thing she had planned. It had emerged out of the enforced simplicity of the days. When there is not much to do, you notice more of what is there. She noticed the way the frost patterns on the window changed, depending on the temperature overnight. She noticed the particular silence that came in the hour before dawn, different from the silence of midnight, different again from the silence of mid-afternoon. She noticed the way the ravens that lived in the far pines communicated across the distance, a conversation she could not understand, but could follow as a sequence of calls and responses over the course of a morning. She noticed, on day 44, that the raven calls that usually ranged freely over a long section of the forest stopped coming from the northeastern corner of it. This meant nothing to her in any specific sense. But she noted it because she was noting everything, and the note turned out to matter, because on day 45, the raven calls were silent in that corner again, and on day 45 she saw M21, at the edge of the northeastern tree line, watching the cabin from a distance she estimated at about 60 meters, and she realized that the ravens had known he was there, and had gone quiet around him, the way small animals go quiet around large ones. She watched him from the porch. He watched her from the trees. He was too far for her to make out his expression with any detail, but she could see the silhouette of him clearly against the gray morning sky behind the tree line, the specific shape of a large wolf, the asymmetry of his stance with the left leg placed differently, the massiveness of him. She raised her hand. Not a wave, exactly, just a lift of the hand, palm out, in a gesture that was neither greeting nor signal, but simply acknowledgement. I see you. I know you're there. He did not respond. Of course he did not respond. He was a wolf, not a person. But he also did not leave immediately, the way he might have if the gesture had unsettled him. He stood for another few minutes at the tree line, and then he turned and went back into the forest, and she stood on the porch in the cold, long after he was gone, her breath making small clouds in the still morning air. Day 45. She wrote it in her notebook, at the tree line, 60 meters. He watched the cabin for 12 minutes before I saw him, possibly longer before that. He stayed for 8 minutes after I raised my hand, then he left. She made a fire and cooked lunch, and thought about patience, about what it cost and what it produced, about an animal who had been learning her patterns for weeks before she had known he was there at all, and who had shown up in her path on day 41, not because she had done anything to invite him, but because he had made some internal calculation, in his own time, in his own terms, that she was not a threat. She thought about what it meant to be read that carefully, by something that accurate, that patient, that unwilling to be wrong. She ate her lunch and washed the dish, and went and sat by the window, and looked at the tree line, and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that she eventually identified as gratitude. Not for anything specific, not for the wolf, exactly, though for him partly. For the fact that she had come here to disappear, and had instead been found. Not by anyone looking for her, by something that would only be found by someone who was not looking. She thought about that for a long time. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote, 45 days. This is not what I expected. I did not come here looking for anything, and I think that is why this is happening. Outside the window, the tree line held its particular dark quiet. The ravens had started calling again from the northeastern corner, which meant he was gone, or had moved further in. She listened to them call back and forth across the cold morning and thought, tomorrow, and the day after, and whatever days come after that. She would walk her route. She would sit with her coffee. She would not try to make anything happen. And if he came to the path again, she would sit down in the snow and not perform anything, and let the morning be what the morning was. That was all. That was exactly enough. The morning she finally touched him, she was not prepared for it. She had been at the cabin for 52 days. The contact between them in the intervening days since day 41 had developed in the way that she was beginning to understand was the only way anything developed with M21, incrementally, on his terms, without announcement. He had appeared in the path again on day 47. He had been closer that time, 15 feet, near enough that she could hear his breathing. She had sat down in the snow again, and he had stood for 11 minutes and then left. On day 49, he had appeared at the edge of the trees while she was sitting on a low fallen log near the path, and he had walked out of the trees and stood 12 feet from her for 6 minutes without looking away from her face. She had not moved. She had not raised the camera. She had barely breathed. On day 50, he had not come. On day 51, he had come, but stayed in the trees, present but not approaching, as if testing whether the arrangement still held after an absence. It did hold. She was there, and still, and patient, and he knew that. And he stayed at the tree line for 20 minutes, and then faded back into the pines. On day 52, she walked her route in the early morning, in a cold that had deepened overnight, the kind of cold that makes your nose ache, and your breath come out in heavy clouds that hang in the still air. She was wearing every layer she had, moving carefully because the path was icy under the new snow. And she was thinking about nothing in particular, which she had come to understand, was the specific mental state that seemed to accompany the mornings when things happened. Not anticipation, not blankness. Something in between. Open. Present. Not leaning toward any particular outcome. M21 stepped out of the trees at the bend in the path. He was not in the center of the path this time. He was at the side of it, near the tree line, walking slowly in the same direction she was walking, parallel to her, at about 10 feet. Walking, not standing, moving at her pace, which was slow because of the ice, in the same direction, as if they were two creatures who happened to be going the same way this morning. She slowed even more, matching whatever pace he was setting, and they walked like that for about 30 feet, which took them around the bend and into the section of path where the trees opened up on the right, and the light came down cleanly. He slowed as the light opened up, and then stopped, and she stopped beside him, 10 feet away, and they stood in the clear light of that cold morning, both of them still, both of them breathing. She did not plan what happened next. Her hand moved. It moved slowly, at her side, without being raised dramatically, or extended toward him at speed. It came out from her body at hip height and opened, palm facing him, in the same gesture she had made from the porch on day 45. Not beckoning, not reaching, just open, present, available. He looked at her hand. His amber eyes dropped from her face to her hand and stayed there. She could see his nostrils working, reading the cold air, reading her, cataloging whatever was carried in her smell that his extraordinary nose could detect, and that she would never be able to perceive herself. 3 seconds, 5 seconds. She lost count. He stepped toward her. 1 step, then another. Her heart was doing something she would not have wanted to try to describe. Her hand did not shake, which surprised her later, because the rest of her was very far from calm. But her hand stayed open, and still at hip height, and he came to it with his head low and slightly angled, the way a wary animal approaches something it has decided to approach, while still reserving the option to retreat, and his nose touched the back of her hand first. The touch lasted half a second. He pulled back slightly, processing. Then he stepped close enough that she could smell him, that dense, complex, wild smell of large predator, and pine, and cold, and something she could not name, that was simply him, and her hand was against his side, against the scar, against the ridge of healed tissue on his left flank, the injury that had changed the course of his life 9 years ago. He exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, deep from somewhere in his chest, and he leaned into her hand. The full weight of him, which was enormous, came against her palm with a kind of trust that was so sudden and so complete that she had to lock her knee to stay standing. She was not a small woman, and she had physical strength from years of field work, but the weight of an adult wolf leaning against your hand is not something your body predicts, and the surprise of it, and the enormity of what it meant, came into her at the same moment, and she stood in the clear, cold light of that morning, with her hand against the scar on his side, and she did not cry, exactly, but her eyes were wet, and she did not look away from him, because she did not want to miss a single second of this. He stood against her hand for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. She knew this because she was counting, silently, the way she had learned to count time in the field when she needed to be precise, without looking at a watch, and she counted all of it. Then he straightened, shifted his weight back onto his own 4 legs, looked at her face for a long moment, and then turned and walked into the trees on the left side of the path, and was gone. She stood in the path for a long time after he left. She did not immediately process what had just happened. Her mind was quiet in a way that she recognized from her field years as the specific quiet that comes directly after something that the brain has not yet categorized, the stillness before the meaning arrives. When she got back to the cabin, she sat at the table for 20 minutes without moving, her coat still on, and then she called Diane. Diane picked up on the second ring. She said, "Nadia, you okay?" Nadia said, "Yes. I need to tell you something. Something happened this morning." She told her. All of it. The walking parallel on the path, the stopping in the light, the hand, the lean. The 4 minutes and 17 seconds, she told it in the flat, precise language she used when she was reporting something in the field, because that was the only way she knew how to convey it without making it smaller by trying to make it larger. When she was done, Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nadia, that's M21. Nadia said, "I know." Diane said, "He has never let anyone touch him. 11 vets over 9 years. Nadia said, "I know." Diane, "Who do I call? Who is the researcher on his case?" Diane said, "Carla Reyes. I have her number." "But Nadia." She said, "What?" Diane said, "Before you call her, just take a breath. Just sit with that for a minute." Nadia looked at the wall. She thought about a wolf, leaning into her hand with the full weight of 9 years behind him. She thought about an exhale, long and slow, from somewhere deep in a chest that had been carrying its own silence for longer than she had been in that cabin. She said, "Okay." She sat with it, just for a minute. Then she picked up the phone and called Carla Reyes. Carla answered on the first ring, which was unusual, and her voice was the brisk and careful voice of someone who was always slightly expecting news. Nadia said, "Dr. Reyes, my name is Nadia Vasquez. I've been staying in the research cabin on the west edge of the region for about 7 weeks. I think I need to talk to you about a wolf." There was a pause. Then Carla said, "M21? Nadia said, "Yes." Another pause. Carla said, "How close have you been to him?" Nadia said, "This morning I had my hand on his side for about 4 minutes." The pause that followed was the longest yet. When Carla spoke again, her careful voice had something underneath it that Nadia could not quite name, but which she later decided was the sound of a person encountering something their work had long predicted, but their experience had stopped expecting. Carla said, "Are you going anywhere soon?" Nadia looked at the wood stove, the small safe warmth of the cabin she had come to in order to disappear. She looked at the tree line through the window, the gap in the pines where the morning light came through differently than anywhere else. She said, "No, I'm not going anywhere." Carla said, "Good. I'm driving up tomorrow. I'll be there before 9. Nadia said, "Okay." She hung up the phone and sat in the warm cabin, and outside the trees were still, and the snow was still, and somewhere in the forest to the east, a gray wolf, with a crooked leg, and a scarred flank, and amber eyes was moving through his territory, the way he always had, on his own terms, in his own time, by his own deep and ungovernable logic. She sat there until the light in the room changed, and the stove needed tending. And then she got up and did the small necessary things. And when she went to sleep that night, she slept deeply and without fear. And the morning, when it came the way mornings do, without announcement, simply there. Carla Reyes drove up from Missoula before dawn. She had not slept well after the call. This was not unusual for her when something significant happened in her work, but the kind of unsleep she experienced after Nadia Vasquez's call was different from the ordinary professional alertness of a researcher with new data. It was more personal than that, and Carla was careful about personal things in her work, careful to keep the two lanes separate, because she had seen other researchers lose precision by letting feeling get ahead of methodology. But she lay in her bed in Missoula at 11 that night and 12 and 1 in the morning, and she was not thinking about methodology. She was thinking about 9 years, about Philip Crane's team losing M21 in 7 days, about Grace Holloway sitting in a blind for 9 days and never laying eyes on him, about her own 3 aerial surveys, her own dozen camera traps, her own file that was thick with data and empty of the one thing she had most wanted, a single genuine encounter, face to face, close enough to matter. And now a photographer who had come to a cabin to hide from her own life had, in 52 days and without any particular intention, accomplished what 11 trained professionals had failed to accomplish in 9 years. Carla turned her bedside light on at 1:30 and got up and made tea and sat at her kitchen table with her file on M21 and read through sections she had read 100 times, looking for what she might have missed. She was not angry. She was not even exactly surprised. If she was honest with herself, she had written, in her second paper, about M21's ability to detect purposeful human approach. She had documented his preference for the presence of things that arrived without agenda, the camera he tolerated, the fox. She had written the sentence, 3 years ago, in print, in a peer-reviewed paper. The subject appears to differentiate between observation and intervention, tolerating the former and consistently avoiding the latter. She had written it. She had believed it. And then she had continued, over the years since, sending professionals with equipment and plans and good intentions into his territory, and being surprised, each time, when he disappeared. She drove north in the dark before dawn, and reached the valley road, as the sky was beginning to lighten, that specific pre-dawn gray that belongs to winter mountain mornings and nowhere else. Owen Marsh was meeting her at the turnoff, because the road to the cabin was confusing if you did not know it, and his truck was already there when she arrived, his breath clouding in the cold air as he climbed out. He said, "You didn't sleep." She said, "No. You?" He said, "Enough." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you want to handle this?" She said, carefully, "Then, I need to talk to her first, understand exactly what happened and what the conditions were, and then I need to think before I do anything else." He said, "She seemed very calm on the phone, from what Diane told me." Carla said, "People who have spent time in difficult field conditions are often calm. It doesn't always mean they're okay." Owen nodded. He knew this. He had worked with enough people who operated in difficult conditions to understand that calm was not always the same as fine. They drove the last section to the cabin in Owen's truck, because his was better suited to the road, and they arrived at 7:40, earlier than Carla had told Nadia, but Nadia was already up. The cabin had a light in the window and smoke coming from the chimney, and when Carla knocked, the door opened almost immediately, as if Nadia had heard the truck. Carla's first impression of Nadia Vasquez was that she was someone who paid close attention to everything in front of her. This was visible in the way she stood in the doorway and looked at both of them, taking in details, not rushing to fill the moment with words. She was wearing heavy indoor layers, her dark hair loose, and she looked like someone who had been awake long enough that the tiredness had become simply part of the morning, rather than something separate from it. She said, "Dr. Reyes, come in." They sat at the small table in the main room with tea, and Nadia told the whole account again. She told it the same way Diane had described, flat, precise, in sequence, without embellishment. Carla listened without interrupting. Owen, who had also heard it secondhand from Diane, listened and watched Nadia's face and believed every word of it, because people who are making things up do not tell stories with that particular absence of drama. When Nadia finished, Carla was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me about the weeks before, what your routine was, how you moved, where you went." Nadia told her about the walking, the mornings, the camera, carried out of habit, the deliberate absence of agenda. She said, I was not trying to see him. I was not tracking him. I walked the same paths at the same times every day because I found it settled me, and the rest of the time I stayed in the cabin. Carla said, Did you know he was watching you before the 41st day? Nadia said, No. I found out later, from reviewing the trail camera footage. He had been in the camera's range 6 times before I knew he was there. Carla turned to Owen. Owen said, My camera on the south section, about a kilometer from here. She didn't know about it. He was crossing that section more frequently than usual, starting around her second week. Carla said, He was tracking her patterns. Nadia said, That's what it looks like. Carla looked at the table for a moment, and then looked at Nadia, and said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer sounds strange. Nadia said, Okay. Carla said, When you were walking in the mornings, what were you thinking about? Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mostly nothing. Sometimes I was counting steps, or listening to the birds. Sometimes I was thinking about things from my own life that I needed to work through, but I wasn't thinking about him. I didn't know enough about him in the early weeks to think about him, Carla said, and on the morning of day 41, when you came around the bend and he was in the path. Nadia said, I stopped. I didn't think about it. I stopped and looked at him, and then I sat down in the snow. Carla said, Why did you sit down? Nadia looked at her, and then looked at the table and said, Because I was tired. I know that sounds stupid. But I was tired of performing, tired of managing how I was in the world. And he was there, and he wasn't threatening me, and something in me just put me down. Carla was quiet for a long time. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, the winter light flat and clear through the cabin window. Owen refilled his tea, and did not say anything. Carla said finally, It doesn't sound stupid. It sounds exactly right. She paused. He's been read as aggressive and antisocial in most of the literature. He's not. He's precise. What he's been refusing, for 9 years, is the posture of intervention. People who come toward him have something they want from him, even if what they want is only to help him, and he knows it, and he removes himself from the situation before it can develop. You came toward nothing. You were walking your own route for your own reasons, and when you encountered him, you responded the way a person responds when they have nothing to prove. You sat down. Owen said quietly, The absence of agenda. Carla looked at him. Yes. Nadia said, What happens now? Carla said, Nothing immediate. I need to observe, carefully and from a distance. I won't approach him, and I won't set up anything near the cabin that might change the conditions. What exists here is extremely fragile, and I won't risk it. Nadia nodded. Carla said, Would you be willing to let me set up one additional camera? Very discreetly, in a location that won't alter your morning route. Nadia said, Yes. Carla said, And will you keep doing exactly what you have been doing? The same route, the same times, the same. Nothing? Nadia looked at her, a small, dry understanding in her expression. Yes, I can keep doing nothing. Carla drove back to the station with Owen, and they sat in the parking lot for a few minutes without getting out. The morning was cold, and the sky was very blue, the specific deep winter blue that comes after the clouds break. Owen said, What do you make of her? Carla said, I think she's exactly who she appears to be. She looked at the mountains, which is exactly why it worked. Owen said, You sound almost relieved. She said, I've been studying him for 9 years. In that time, I have learned a great deal about what he will refuse, and I have been trying, in various ways and through various approaches, to find what he might accept. She paused. It turns out, what he accepts is someone who arrived here needing exactly what this place offered, and who asked nothing of him, and who sat down in the snow on the 41st morning, because she was tired. She looked at Owen. That is not something I could have designed, or predicted, or sent someone to replicate. Owen said, No. Carla said, No. You can't train for the absence of agenda. You either have it or you don't. Owen looked at the mountains for a moment, then he said, So what do we do? Carla said, We wait. We watch. We let her keep walking her route. A pause. And we see what he does next. Inside the cabin at the end of the valley road, Nadia Vasquez was washing the morning's cups, and looking at the tree line through the window above the sink. The gap in the pines where the light came down differently than anywhere else. She was thinking about the weight of a wolf leaning into her palm. The long, shuddering exhale, the amber eyes that had looked at her face for a long moment before he turned and walked away. She dried the cups and put them on the shelf and picked up her notebook and wrote the number 52 at the top of the page. Then she sat down and thought about what to write under it, and what she wrote was this: he was there. He let me. I don't know what it means, but it happened, and it was real, and I am very grateful that I was too tired to be strategic about it. She put the notebook down and looked at the tree line. The ravens were calling in the northeastern corner of the forest. She listened to them call back and forth, that conversation she could follow but not translate, and she thought about M21 moving through the snow somewhere beyond the trees, his crooked leg giving his gait its particular role, his nose reading the cold air, moving through his territory the way he always had. She thought, tomorrow. She thought, whatever tomorrow brings. And she sat in the warm cabin in the clear mountain morning and let the day be what it was, and nothing more, and nothing less. Carla set up the camera on a Thursday morning, before Nadia's usual walking time, working quietly and quickly with Owen's help, placing it high enough in a pine on the east side of the path that it would not change the sight lines, and low enough to capture detail in the corridor, where the most significant encounters had happened. It took them 14 minutes. They were back in Owen's truck and off the cabin road, before Nadia finished her first cup of coffee. She had known they would be there. Carla had messaged the night before to let her know. But when Nadia walked out onto the porch that morning, and the path looked exactly as it always had, the camera invisible in the tree, she felt the specific relief of someone who had been told a change was coming, and found that the change had arrived without disturbing anything. The camera transmitted wirelessly to a receiver Carla had left at the station, and Owen checked the footage each morning, downloading the overnight captures and reviewing them before he did anything else. On the first morning, the camera showed Nadia walking her route at 7:45, moving at her usual pace, the wide-angle camera hanging at her side unused. The path was empty of anything else. On the second morning, at 2:40 in the night, the camera showed M21 crossing the path at the bend, moving east to west, not stopping, his movement fluid despite the leg, and his pace steady. He crossed in 8 seconds. He did not look at the new camera. On the third morning, nothing. On the fourth morning, at 6:50, 18 minutes before Nadia came out of the cabin, M21 was at the bend in the path. He was not crossing. He was standing, facing east, toward the cabin, standing still in the early light that was just beginning to come through the pines, his breath making small clouds in the cold. He stood there for 6 minutes, and then stepped back into the trees on the western side of the path. Owen sent that clip to Carla with a message that said, "He's waiting." Carla was in Missoula and replied within 2 minutes, "Don't tell Nadia. I don't want her walking towards something. I want her to walk like she always does." Owen said, "Agreed." On the 6th morning after the camera was installed, Nadia came around the bend at 7:50, and M21 was in the path. He was at a distance of approximately 12 feet, which was closer than he had ever been on the path before. He was standing sideways to her, not facing her directly, which Carla would later note in her log was a significant posture, not confrontational, not submissive, simply present, an "I am here" that did not demand a response. Nadia stopped. She did not sit down this time. She stood and looked at him, and he stood sideways and looked at the forest ahead of them, and they held that arrangement until he slowly turned his head and looked at her face, and then he turned his whole body until he was facing her and walked 4 steps toward her, closing the distance to about 8 feet. She was very still. He lowered his head slightly and then raised it again, a movement that Carla, watching the footage that evening, identified as a form of approach behavior in predators that want to reduce the signal of threat. He was making himself smaller, not because he was afraid of her, because he was trying to communicate that she did not need to be afraid of him. Nadia, who had spent years reading the body language of people in difficult situations, read it correctly. She felt no fear. She felt the things she had been feeling in these encounters since the 41st day, the quality of presence and aliveness that had no good name, but which was unmistakably real. He walked the remaining 8 feet. He stopped 1 foot from her. He was enormous up close. She had known this intellectually, but the reality of a full-grown wolf at 1 foot's distance is different from anything intellectual. She could see the detail of his coat, the individual guard hairs, the texture of the scar. She could see the way his left leg was set, the small adjustment in his posture that distributed his weight away from it, without making the adjustment look like effort. She could see his eyes, amber and direct, not predatory, not soft, simply seeing. She lifted her hand, the way she had on day 52, and he put his nose to the back of it. One quick touch, already familiar with the smell of her, and then he turned his head and pressed his cheek against her open palm. She stood in the path in the morning cold, with her palm against the cheek of a wolf who had refused the world for 9 years, and she did not cry this time, and she did not lose her footing, and she stayed exactly where she was for as long as he wanted, which was 3 minutes and 41 seconds. When he pulled away, he did not leave immediately. He stood at arm's length and looked at her for a moment, and then at the forest ahead of them, east and then west, a sweep that seemed habitual rather than alarmed, the look of an animal surveying his territory as a matter of ordinary practice. Then he walked west on the path, slowly, with his crooked leg roll, and she turned and watched him go, and at the bend in the path he stopped and turned his head back and looked at her one more time. Then he went around the bend, and she was alone in the path in the morning light. Carla reviewed the footage that evening and did not speak for a long time after it finished. Owen sat across from her in the station break room and waited, which he was good at. She said, "His stress markers are flat. The posture, the movement, the ear position. He is not tolerating this. He is choosing it." Owen said, "There's a difference." She said, "A significant one. A stressed animal that tolerates handling will eventually respond with either aggression or withdrawal. What I'm watching is an animal that is initiating contact on his own terms. He is approaching her. He is timing it. He is deciding when to come and when to leave." She paused. "He has not surrendered his autonomy. He has extended it to include her." Owen said, "That's a nice way to put it." She said, "It's accurate." She looked at the screen where the footage had finished. The path was empty now, just the morning light on snow. "I need to write about this very carefully, because what I'm watching defies the framework I've been using, and I want to get the new framework right." She began writing that night, in the small room she had rented in the town closest to the regional station, sitting at the desk with her laptop and her file, and the footage playing on a loop on a secondary screen while she worked. She wrote for 4 hours, and what emerged was not yet a paper. It was the beginning of an argument, not about M21 specifically, but about what M21 illustrated, that the behavior of wild animals in proximity to humans was not a simple axis from avoidance to tolerance, but something more complex, that included the animal's reading of what the human carried into the encounter, the invisible but detectable weight of intention, agenda, the desire to fix or help or document. She wrote, "The most significant variable in these encounters may not be technique or training or the professional qualifications of the human. It may be the fundamental quality of what the human is bringing to the moment, whether they arrive carrying something they want, or whether they arrive carrying nothing at all." She wrote, "This is almost impossible to teach. It may be impossible to cultivate under professional conditions, because the conditions of professional wildlife work are, by their nature, purposeful. You go into the field with an objective. You carry the weight of your objective without realizing you carry it. And some animals, apparently, can read that weight with precision sufficient to make avoidance feel, from their perspective, like the only logical response." She wrote, "What Nadia Vasquez had was not training. It was the specific quality of a person who had come to a remote place for reasons entirely unrelated to the animal she would encounter, and who had therefore approached every morning with her attention directed at her own situation rather than at him. He had been, from her perspective, a fascinating incidental discovery rather than a target." She stopped typing and looked at what she had written, and then looked at the footage playing silently on the secondary screen. A woman in the snow, her hand against a wolf's cheek, both of them still in the morning light. She thought about what Owen had said. He is letting himself be seen. She typed one more sentence. The right absence is sometimes the most powerful presence. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed, and this time she slept, deeply and without interruption, through the rest of the cold mountain night. 2 days later, she drove back to the cabin and knocked on Nadia's door and showed her the footage. Nadia watched it in silence, standing at the small table, because she had not sat down, watching herself from the outside for the first time. watching M21 from an angle she had not had in the moments of the encounters, seeing what she had not been able to see from where she stood, the deliberateness of his approach, the economy of his movement, the way he positioned himself and then waited, giving her time and space within the encounter before closing the distance further. When the footage finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's been planning these." Carla said, "Yes, that's what it looks like." Nadia looked at the screen. He decided what he was going to do before he came out of the trees. Carla said, "Every time. As far as I can tell. He's not being spontaneous. He's been reading you for weeks, and each encounter has been a deliberate step." Nadia said, "Toward what?" Carla said, "I think toward exactly what you're seeing. Contact. On his terms. At his pace. Without anything being required of him that he hasn't chosen to give." Nadia was quiet for a long moment. She looked out the window at the tree line. Then she said, "So what do I do? Keep doing what I'm doing?" Carla said, "Keep doing what you're doing. Don't alter the route. Don't try to extend the encounters. Don't bring food. Don't do anything differently from what has already produced this." Nadia said, "Nothing." Carla said, "Nothing." "Exactly." Nadia nodded slowly. She looked at the footage one more time, the still frame on the screen, where the path was empty and the morning light was falling through the pines in that particular way. She said, 9 years. Carla said, 9 years. Nadia said, "What changed?" Carla considered the question for a long moment, because it was the real question, the one that the data pointed toward but did not fully answer. She said, "I'm not certain, but I think 2 things. I think the years of camera exposure habituated him to being observed without consequence, and I think you arrived in a state that he could read accurately." She paused. "You were not pretending to be safe. You were not managing your presentation for his benefit. You were genuinely someone in a difficult period of your own life, moving through this landscape for your own reasons, with nothing to prove, and nothing to take from him. And he read that." She looked at Nadia carefully. "He's very good at reading things." Nadia said, "I know." A pause. "I've noticed." They stood in the cabin in the winter morning, and outside the ravens were calling in the pines, and somewhere in the forest, M21 was moving through his territory. This animal who had learned to read the weight of human intention, and who had, finally, after 9 years of reading people who were carrying too much of it, found someone who had arrived empty-handed. Not because she was special, not because she had training or technique, because she had needed a place to be without performing anything, and the forest had given her one, and the wolf who lived in the forest had read what she carried in the same air she breathed, and had decided, with all the precision available to him, that this one was safe. Not because she could fix him, not because she had come to help, because she was just there, in the cold morning, walking her route, and when he appeared in the path she had been too tired to be anything other than herself. That was all it had taken. After 9 years, that was all. The hardest part, Carla said later, was that there were no instructions. She had been a researcher for 23 years. She had been in situations where the data was complicated, or the methods were contested, or the conclusions were uncertain. But she had always had a framework within which the complications existed, a set of protocols and practices and professional norms that gave shape to the work, even when the work was difficult. What was happening in that narrow section of Montana forest that winter had no framework she could fully apply. She was watching something that her training had described in theory, but that her experience had never confirmed, and she was watching it happen through a woman who had no professional involvement with wildlife, and who had not intended any of this, and she did not know what to do with that, except watch it carefully, and try not to disturb it. She drove up to the cabin twice a week through February. She did not approach M21's territory directly. She reviewed footage at the station, and she talked to Nadia in the evenings, and she walked the path with Owen, on the days when Nadia had already been out, and M21 was unlikely to appear again. She was gathering data with the care of someone who understood that the data was fragile, that the conditions that had produced it could not be recreated deliberately, that any move she made in the wrong direction could end it. The encounters between Nadia and M21 continued through February and into March. They did not escalate dramatically. They developed at the same deliberate pace that had characterized the whole sequence, each encounter slightly different from the last, in some small way, each one confirming and extending the arrangement between them, without altering its essential nature. He came when he came. He left when he chose. She walked her route every morning, and she was available, and still, and when he appeared, she stayed that way. In the third week of February, he walked with her, for a longer stretch than he had before, parallel, on her left side, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him, if she had chosen to. She did not reach out. She kept her arms at her sides, and walked at her pace, and he walked at his, and they moved through the winter forest together for about 400 meters, before he peeled away into the trees without announcement. She did not mark the spot where he left. She walked the rest of her route, and went home, and drank her coffee, and sat at the table, and wrote the number of the day in her notebook, and under it she wrote, 400 meters, side by side. Neither of us spoke. She called it that in her own private accounting, the time neither of us spoke. It was the most accurate thing she could say about most of the encounters. They were silent. They were the kind of communication that happens when language is not available and not needed, when two beings in the same space simply confirm each other's presence without requiring anything more than that. Carla recorded everything. She was building a second paper, though she did not yet know its final argument. She knew the data, which was unambiguous. M21, a wolf with a 9-year documented history of refusing human contact, was initiating voluntary contact with a specific human on a regular basis. The contact was not traumatic. The stress indicators visible in the footage were within normal range for a wolf in familiar territory. He was not showing signs of habituation in the negative sense, the bored indifference of a captive animal. He was showing active interest, intentional approach, voluntary engagement. He came because he chose to come. He left because he chose to leave. The whole thing was his, and Nadia was the thing he had chosen it with. The part Carla could not fully explain, and which she turned over in her mind on the long drives between Missoula and the valley, was the question of recognition. What had M21 recognized in Nadia that he had not recognized in 9 years of researchers and rangers and veterinarians? What was the signal, the thing his extraordinary sensory and social perception had read in her, that it had read differently in everyone else? She had her argument about agenda and the absence of it. She believed that argument, but she also believed it was incomplete, because Nadia was not the only person who had ever walked in that forest without targeting M21 specifically. Owen walked those paths regularly, and had done for years. Other rangers had passed through. Hikers occasionally used the lower trails. M21 had not initiated contact with any of them. It was something more specific than the absence of agenda. It was something about this particular person in this particular moment, in her particular life. She brought this to Nadia one evening in February, sitting at the small table with tea, the stove going and the windows showing the dark of the winter night outside. She said, "Can I ask you something personal?" Nadia said, "You can ask." Carla said, "When you came here, what were you coming from?" Nadia looked at the table for a moment. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding how much to say, not because they want to withhold, but because they are not sure how to explain something accurately. Then she said, "I was in a situation at home that had made me feel unsafe for a long time, someone who would not respect the boundary between his life and mine. I came here because I needed to be somewhere that couldn't be followed." Carla said, "How long had that been going on?" Nadia said, "About a year before I left, maybe longer in the early stages, when I was still trying to decide if I was reading it correctly." Carla said, "A year of being watched by something that meant you harm." Nadia said, "Yes." Carla was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea. She said, M21 spent 9 years being approached by things that meant him well. In his reading of those approaches, well-meaning and threatening may have registered the same. Nadia looked at her. Carla said, "And you spent a year being approached by something that did not mean you well. In your reading, every approach, every footstep, every appearance behind you, was something to assess for danger." Nadia said, "Yes." Carla said, "So you both arrived in this forest, having learned the same thing. That something approaching you with purpose is something to be read very carefully and very quickly. That presence is never neutral. That what a thing carries toward you matters more than what it says." Nadia was very still. Carla said, "And then you found each other in the path. And he read you the way he reads everything, and what he found was not a professional with a plan. He found someone who had also learned, the hard way, to read approach. Someone who was hyper-aware of presence. Someone who knew, in her body, what it meant to have something come at you, and to feel it before it arrived. She paused. And that, I think he recognized. Not her training, not her qualifications. The specific quality of being a person who has been hunted, and who knows what it feels like, and who would therefore never carry that weight toward anything else. The cabin was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving in the pine tops with a low, steady sound. Nadia said, after a long time, 2 hunted things in the same clearing. Carla said, yes, that's exactly what it is. They sat with that for a while. It was not a comfortable thought, not a warm and pretty thing. It was true, which is a different quality entirely from warm or pretty. It was the kind of truth that, once you see it, you cannot unsee, and which arranges itself in your understanding, in a place where it will stay permanently. Nadia said, does that go in your paper? Carla said, some version of it, carefully phrased, with the appropriate hedges. She looked at Nadia. But yes, it goes in the paper. Nadia nodded. She looked out the dark window toward the tree line she could not see in the night. She said, I don't know if that makes it sadder or better. Carla said, I think it makes it true, which is its own category. Owen, who was not there for that conversation, but who Carla told about it on the drive back the next morning, was quiet for a while on the road. Then he said, she's right, you know. She said, 2 hunted things in the same clearing. Carla said, yes. He said, that is the whole story. She said, yes, in 6 words. Owen drove, and the mountains were clear in the morning light, and somewhere in them, in the section of territory that was his and had been his for 9 years, a wolf was moving through the snow on his own particular path, his crooked leg leaving its asymmetric print in the fresh white surface, going about the business of his own life. Carla looked at the mountains. She thought about 9 years. She thought about everything she had documented and everything she had missed, and the one thing she had not been able to see, until a woman who had not come looking for it had simply sat down in the snow one morning and let it find her. She thought, this is the part no one will believe is real, the part where the thing that cannot be planned for turns out to be the only thing that worked. She thought, and yet. In late March, the person in Denver who had made Nadia's apartment impossible to be in was located by law enforcement, and the situation that had brought her to the cabin was formally resolved. Diane called to tell her. Nadia sat on the porch with the phone and listened, and said the appropriate things, and hung up, and sat in the cold spring air that was just beginning to have a different quality than the deep winter air, something softer underneath the chill, the first suggestion that the season would eventually change. She should have felt purely relieved. She did feel relieved, but she also felt something she had not expected, which was a sharp awareness that the reason for her being here was technically gone, and that without the reason, she would need to decide to stay or to go, and that deciding felt heavier than the absence of decision had felt. She called Diane back and said, I'm going to stay a while longer. Diane said, I thought you might. She stayed through April. She walked her routes in the mornings, and the light changed as the month moved forward, coming earlier and lasting longer, and the forest changed with it, the frozen creek thawing and beginning to move again, the undergrowth starting to show the first green, the ravens joined now by other birds whose calls were different from the winter ones, and which filled the morning with a different kind of sound. 121 kept coming, not every day. The encounters in March and April were less frequent than they had been in February, which Carla noted with interest and ascribed partly to the season. Spring meant more prey moving, more territory to cover, more of the ordinary wolf business of living, that had less to do with this particular path and this particular woman, and more to do with the demands of his environment. But he came. When he came, the quality of the encounters was unchanged, deliberate, calm, on his terms. He had not stopped choosing her. He had simply incorporated her into a life that had other components. Carla was in Missoula when Owen called her in the second week of April and told her what the footage from that morning showed. She pulled over on the road and watched it on her phone, the footage transferring slowly on the rural connection, and she sat in her car on the side of the road and watched it 3 times. M21 was on the path at the bend. He was not walking. He was sitting, which she had never seen him do on the path before. He was sitting in the center of the path at the bend, and Nadia was sitting in the snow on the side of the path, and they were 8 feet apart, and neither of them was looking at the other. M21 was looking east, toward wherever the morning scent was coming from. Nadia was looking at the trees above the path. They were simply in the same place, in the clear April morning, with no particular exchange happening between them, other than the plain fact of shared space and mutual ease. They sat like that for 11 minutes. Then M21 stood up in that particular way of large dogs and wolves, back end first, and shook himself once, a brief full-body movement, and looked at Nadia's face for a moment. Then he walked east on the path, away from her this time rather than into the trees, moving at an easy pace with his crooked leg roll, until he rounded a bend in the distance and was out of frame. Nadia sat in the snow for another few minutes. Then she got up and walked back the way she had come. Carla sat in her car on the side of the road and thought about what she had just watched. She thought about all the words that would not quite fit it. She thought about the frameworks she had been trained to apply and how none of them had a category for two beings sitting 8 feet apart on an April morning, looking at different things, in the specific ease of those who have reached an understanding that does not require ongoing confirmation. She thought, trust. Not the beginning of trust. Not trust building. Trust, the arrived state. The thing that exists after everything that led to it is no longer necessary to keep rehearsing. The state where you can simply be in the same place and look at different things and not need to prove anything to each other, because the proving is done, has been done, in the long accumulating sequence of mornings behind you. She called Owen. She said, "Did you see the April footage?" He said, "Yes." She said, "What do you make of it?" He said, without hesitation, "That's what it looks like when something is settled." She said, "Yes." He said, "Is that what you're going to call it in the paper?" She said, "Probably not those words exactly, but yes, that's what I'm going to say." She drove the rest of the way to Missoula and went to her office and sat at her desk and opened her laptop and looked at what she had written so far. It was the most important paper she had ever worked on, and it was also the most difficult, because the most important thing in it kept resisting the forms that academic writing required. The story was real, the data was real, the footage was real, but the meaning of it, the thing it actually demonstrated, sat at the edge of what scientific language could hold. She wrote anyway. She wrote about behavioral observation and voluntary contact initiation and stress markers and documented encounter frequency. She wrote carefully about the distinction between tolerance and choice and about what the evidence suggested regarding M21's motivational state during the encounters. She wrote about the possible mechanisms by which he might have read Nadia's behavioral profile as different from the profiles of the professionals who had attempted to approach him over 9 years. And then, in the discussion section, she wrote a paragraph that she left in, after a long debate with herself, about whether it was appropriate, and which was the paragraph that would be most quoted when the paper was eventually published. She wrote, "What this case documents is not a technique that can be replicated. What it documents is a condition. The condition is the specific quality of a human presence that carries no intention toward the animal, no rescue, no help, no data collection, no agenda of any kind. This condition cannot be performed. It can only exist in a person who is genuinely there for reasons that have nothing to do with the animal, and who encounters the animal as a genuine surprise rather than a planned subject. The implications of this for wildlife rehabilitation and human-animal proximity research are significant, and are simultaneously discouraging for anyone who hoped the lesson was actionable. You cannot teach someone to carry nothing. You can only recognize it in a person who already has nothing to carry." She read it back once, and then sent the draft to her peer reviewer, without changing it. Owen read it when she shared it with him the following week, and he sat with it for a while, and then he said, "Is it going to cause problems in your field?" She said, "Probably some." He said, "Is it true?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then publish it." She did. Nadia left the cabin in early May. She had been there for just under 4 months. She drove back to Denver because her life was there, and the reasons not to be there were resolved, and at some point, you have to go back to the life that is waiting for you, even when the place you are leaving has given you something that you will never fully be able to explain to the people in that life. She stopped the truck at the end of the cabin road and looked back at the property for a moment. The porch, the stovepipe, the tree line at the back, the pines she had walked under every morning for 4 months. She thought about the first morning she had walked out there, alone and tired and not looking for anything. She thought about day 41, sitting down in the snow. She thought about day 52, her hand on the scar. She thought about an April morning when she and a wolf had sat 8 feet apart in the path and looked at different things, and neither of them had needed anything from the other, and both of them had been exactly where they were. Just that, nothing more, in the clear morning light. She drove south. The mountains were in the rearview mirror for a long time before they disappeared behind the curve of the valley. She got home and opened the apartment, and it was her apartment. Safe now, familiar, and she stood in the middle of it and let it be familiar around her. She was changed, and the apartment was the same, and that was fine. That was how it worked. You changed. The places you were before you changed stayed as they were. The change was in you, not in them. She unpacked her bags and found, in the bottom of the last one, the small notebook. She sat at her kitchen table and flipped through it, the numbers, 1, through however many days she had stayed. The single sentences under some of them. She found day 41. He was in the path. He stood still. I sat down. He stayed for almost 25 minutes. I don't know what I did right. Maybe nothing. Maybe that was the point. She closed the notebook and put it on the shelf where she kept things that mattered to her. Then she made coffee and opened her laptop and looked at the photographs from the 4 months. There were thousands of them. Light on snow, ice crystals, ravens, the creek in various states of freeze and thaw, a fox, young, red, appearing in 5 different images near the tree line, frost, morning light, more morning light, in the 1,000 variations that morning light in a mountain forest can have. And in one photograph, blurred and imprecise, taken with a shaking hand on the 52nd morning, a large gray shape in a clearing at moderate distance, caught at the far limit of the frame, the edges indistinct, the light not quite catching him clearly, just enough to know he was there. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to her work and her life, and she carried what she had brought back with her quietly, and without making a production of it, the way people carry the things that have changed them most essentially. Carla published her paper in the fall. It was read widely in her field and discussed at conferences, and was, as she had predicted, somewhat controversial in the parts that could not be reduced to methodology. But it stood. The data was solid and the footage was real, and what it showed was what it showed, and eventually even the most skeptical readers acknowledged that the central observation was accurate, even if the implications were uncomfortable. Owen kept his roots and his camera at the creek bank, and his careful records. He saw M21 3 more times over the following winter, always at distance, always the wolf moving through his territory on his own business. He noted each sighting in his log and sent the notes to Carla. Carla kept the file. She kept adding to it. She would add to it until there was nothing more to add. And in Denver, Nadia Vasquez kept walking in the mornings, not in a mountain forest, on the streets of her city, in the early morning before the day filled up, when the light was specific, and the sounds were particular, and everything that was there plainly, without decoration. She walked with the camera hanging at her side out of habit, and sometimes she used it and sometimes she did not, and she kept her attention in the way she had learned to keep it in the cold mornings in Montana, present, open, not leaning toward any particular outcome. She was not looking for anything. She had learned, conclusively and in the most unlikely classroom, what happened when you stopped looking and simply showed up, empty-handed and available, in whatever clearing the day put you in. You could not predict what would come to you when you were like that. You could not plan for it, or design it, or train for it. You could only be it, and wait, and trust that something, somewhere, was reading the quality of what you were carrying toward it, the lightness of nothing to prove, and deciding whether to step out of the trees. November came to the Montana Valley the way November always did, with a directness that the earlier months did not have. October could still be argued with. You could look at an October day and believe on the warm afternoons that the season had not quite committed to what it was going to become. November did not offer that argument. November was settled. The temperatures dropped and stayed dropped, and the light left earlier each day with the matter-of-fact quality of something that did not owe you an explanation. Owen noticed the change in M21's movement patterns in the second week of November. He had been noticing M21's movement patterns for long enough that the change registered, before he could have said precisely what it was. The territory coverage was slightly reduced. The frequency of appearance on the creek cameras which had been consistent for years, dropped by roughly a third. The camera on the path showed no visits for 4 days, then one, then nothing for another week. He told Carla. She came up. They walked the territory together, Owen and Carla, on a clear November morning, following the paths they knew well, checking the cameras, reading the snow. The signs were there, but they were not dramatic. A slightly irregular track in one location, evidence of a rest stop in a sheltered spot that was not his usual resting location. Small things. The kind of things that required years of familiarity with a specific animal to read correctly, and they both had that familiarity. Carla said, "He's slowing down." Owen said, "Yes." They did not say more than that. There was not more to say that would have been useful. He was old, by the standards of his life and his situation. The hard years he had survived, the injury, the solitude, the long work of maintaining territory alone for nearly a decade, had accumulated in him the way accumulated things do, not visibly for the most part, until the visible signs appeared, and then you understood that they had been building for a long time. Owen found M21 on a morning in the last week of November, not far from the creek. He was resting against the base of a large pine in the shelter of its roots, in a spot where the tree blocked the north wind, and the ground had a slight warmth from the root system below. He was alive when Owen found him. His eyes were open, amber and direct as always, and he looked at Owen with the same clear, assessing look he had turned on him on that October morning 11 years ago in the forest. And Owen stood at a respectful distance and looked back, and neither of them moved. He was not in distress. This was important to Owen, who stood there long enough to be sure of it. He was simply resting, deeply, in a way that an old animal rests when the body has decided it is done, and has chosen a good place to be done in. The pine was a good place. The shelter was real, and the ground was dry under him, and the morning was quiet. Owen said, quietly, to no one in particular, "You did good." He stood with M21 for a while. He called Carla and she came. She stood beside Owen, and they both stood at the respectful distance, and were quiet, because quiet was the right thing to be. M21 died that afternoon, not violently, not in fear, not alone in the way that might have been his fate on that spring day 9 years ago, when no one could reach him, and he had refused everyone who tried. Alone in the other sense, in his own territory, in his own chosen spot, with the people who had watched over his years from a distance, standing witness, at a respectful distance, which was the closest they had ever managed to get to him in all the years before Nadia, and which, after Nadia, was close enough. Owen wrote the incident report that evening, careful and precise, the way he wrote all his reports. He described the location, and the time, and the condition of the animal. He wrote, "Subject M21, estimated age 12-13 years, found at rest in shelter near the South Creek, consistent with age-related decline. No signs of distress or trauma. Subject was at peace in his territory." That last sentence was not standard incident report language. Owen left it in anyway. He sent the report to the regional authority, and he sent a copy to Carla. Carla received it at her desk in Missoula. She read it twice. Then she sat for a while without doing anything, her hands on the desk, the November light coming through the office window at its low winter angle. She thought about a file that was now complete. Not finished in the sense that she would stop reading it, she would read it for the rest of her career. But complete in the sense that the story in it had reached its end, and the end was the right one, and the right one was quiet and unhurried, and in a sheltered spot under a pine with the wind blocked, and the ground dry and the morning still. She thought about 9 years of refusal. She thought about 11 veterinarians, and every plan that had dissolved in the face of his precision. She thought about Owen at the creek bank on an October morning, crouching over tracks the size of his hand, feeling dread instead of excitement. She thought about camera footage, and incident reports, and a paper that had been controversial in the right ways. She thought about Nadia, sitting down in the snow on day 41, because she was too tired to be strategic. She thought about what you could not teach, and could not design for, and could not produce on purpose. The specific quality of someone who arrives with nothing to prove and nothing to take, who sits down in the cold when a wild thing is in the path because sitting down is the honest thing, and the honest thing is the only thing left after you have been carrying fear for a long time and have finally put it down. She thought about a wolf pressing his cheek against an open palm with all the weight of 9 years behind him. she thought. This is the only ending that would have been right for him. On his terms. In his territory. In his time. She picked up the phone and called Nadia. It rang 4 times, and then Nadia answered with a voice that was in the middle of a day, present and alive, and somewhere in her life in Denver that was going on. She said, "Carla." Carla said, "He's gone. This morning." There was a pause. Nadia said, "Was he okay?" Carla said, "He was okay. He found a good spot. It was quiet." Nadia said, "Good." A breath. "Good." They were quiet together on the phone for a moment. Outside Carla's window, the November light was doing the thing it did in this season, falling at that particular angle that made everything look both clear and already slightly past. Nadia said, "I've been thinking about him a lot lately. I don't know why. I just have." Carla said, "I think that makes sense." Nadia said, "He changed something for me. I don't have a more precise way to say it than that." Carla said, "You changed something for him too, for all of us who were trying to understand him." She paused. "He let you in, Nadia. He let you in when he let no one else. That is not a small thing." Nadia said, "I know." They talked for a few more minutes, small things, how the work was going, how the winter looked to be, whether Carla was planning another season in the valley. Then they said goodbye and hung up, and Carla sat at her desk in the November afternoon and looked at the closed file on her screen. She opened it one more time. She went to the photograph that Owen had taken the previous spring, the one that had ended up in her paper, M21 standing at the edge of the path in the morning light, looking sideways towards something out of frame, completely at ease, his left paw placed in its particular way, his coat thick in the cold air. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about everything the photograph did not show, all the years before it, all the refused attempts, all the precise disappearances, all the nights at the creek bank with the camera, all the things that had had to be exactly what they were in order for this moment in the photograph to happen. She thought about the fox pressed against his side on a winter night. She thought about an October morning, and Owen crouching over tracks in the mud. She thought about a woman driving north with 2 cameras and nowhere particular to be, arriving at a cabin at the edge of the forest, not knowing that the forest had someone in it who had been deciding things for 9 years and had not yet decided about her. She thought about readiness, about how it cannot be rushed and cannot be manufactured, and how the people who try to rush it or manufacture it always fail, not because they lack skill, but because the thing they are trying to produce cannot be produced from the outside. It can only arrive from the inside, in its own time, when whatever needs to change has changed enough. She closed the photograph. She sat at her desk for a moment longer, and then she turned off the office light and put on her coat and went out into the November afternoon, which was cold and clear and, in the way of late autumn afternoons when the sky is high and the light is at its low angle, very beautiful. She walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment, without starting the engine. She looked at the mountains visible from the parking lot, pale blue at this distance, their tops in cloud. She thought, somewhere up there, under a pine tree at the edge of a frozen creek, in a section of territory that was his and had always been his, the ground was keeping him now, the same ground he had walked and marked and defended and lived on for more than a decade. He had not left it. He had settled into it, which was, for an animal who had always known exactly where he was, the most natural thing in the world. She started the engine and drove home. Owen, back at his station, filed his report, and then sat for a while in the break room with a cup of coffee he was not really drinking. He thought about the first time he had followed those tracks in the mud, 11 years ago, that October morning when his first feeling had been dread. He thought about standing in the trees at 30 feet with his thermos in his hand, being assessed. He thought about all the years between that morning and this one. He thought about what Carla had said, years earlier, standing at the creek bank. He is letting himself be seen. He thought. He did. Eventually, he found the conditions that were right, and in those conditions, he let himself be seen, and what was seen was something extraordinary. He drank the rest of his cold coffee, and washed the cup, and went back to his desk, and looked at the maps on the wall, and thought about tomorrow's routes, the roads he would drive, and the cameras he would check, and the landscape he would be responsible for, which was still there, which still had everything in it that it always had, -1. -1. He looked at the map for a while. Then he got his coat, and went out to his truck, and drove his afternoon route, through the valley, and up toward the tree line, and along the roads he knew by feel, after all these years. And when he got to the turnoff for the south section, he stopped for a moment, and looked at the forest. The trees were still, the light was failing. Somewhere in the dark of the pines, behind the ordinary surface of the wilderness that kept its own counsel, something that had been there was no longer there, and the forest kept its silence about that, the same way it kept its silence about everything else. Absolutely, and without any indication that the silence was a loss. He sat in the truck and looked at the forest for a moment, then he drove on. The paper came out in January, 4 months after M21 died, 2 months after Carla had completed the final revisions, and sent it through the last round of review. Its full title was longer, and more technical than what anyone who discussed it would use. What people in her field called it when they talked about it in shorthand was the M21 paper, or sometimes just the Reyes paper, or occasionally, among the researchers who had found it most challenging, the nothing paper, said with a tone that was only partly dismissive, and was underneath that something more complicated. The response was not uniform. Some of her colleagues read it as a genuine contribution to the understanding of voluntary human-animal contact and the motivational architecture of wild predators. Some read it as an interesting case study that was too specific to one animal to support the broader claims she was making. Some read it as being too philosophical for a peer-reviewed paper and said so in their reviews, not enough to prevent publication, but enough to require her to revise the discussion section 3 times before the final version was something all the reviewers could accept. The paragraph about carrying nothing stayed in. She had fought for it, quietly and with the thoroughness that she applied to everything, and in the end, the editors had left it because they could not identify a factual error in it, only a discomfort, and discomfort was not a reason to cut a paragraph that was accurate. The paper was read more widely than her previous work. It was shared in communities she did not usually reach, people who worked with animals in sanctuaries, people who did rehabilitation work, people who were interested in the question of what it meant for 2 different kinds of being to establish genuine contact across the gap between species. She received more emails than she could answer, from people who wanted to know more, who had their own experiences that seemed to rhyme with what she described, who had questions she could not always answer, because the questions were at the edge of what the data could support. She answered what she could. She was honest about what she did not know. She directed people to the data, which was available, and to the footage, which she had arranged to have archived with the Regional Wildlife Authority, and she told everyone who asked, the same thing she had told Owen on the morning she first heard about Day 52. We cannot replicate this. The conditions that produced it were specific and unrepeatable, but we can understand what it shows us, and what it shows us is worth understanding, even if we cannot use it as a recipe. Nadia did not read the paper right away. She let it sit for a few weeks after Carla sent it to her, because she knew herself well enough to know that she needed to be in the right state to read something that was, in one sense, about her life. When she did read it, she read it twice, the second time more slowly, stopping at the paragraph she had been told about, the one that had required 3 revisions, and whose survival in the final text had required Carla to argue for it. She read it 3 times, on the second pass, and then sat with it. She understood what Carla had written. She understood it in the precise and embodied way of someone who had been the subject of it, who had lived the condition it described from the inside. She could not carry nothing now, in the same way she had carried nothing in that first winter at the cabin, because she was no longer the person who had arrived there. The 4 months had changed her, as all significant things do, and the change meant she was not empty in the same way anymore. She was fuller. The encounter had filled something. But she understood, reading the paper, what she had been when it happened. She understood that she had come to that cabin genuinely unequipped for what occurred, that she had no training for it, and no ambition toward it, and no stake in the outcome, and that this precise unequippedness was what had made her the right person for the 52 mornings. You cannot make yourself unequipped. You cannot perform emptiness. It has to be real. She put the paper down and looked at the small notebook on the shelf, the one with the numbered days. She thought about carrying it north, without knowing she was carrying it, without any plan about what would be written in it. She thought about the morning she had not sat down strategically, had not acted from training, had not done anything at all except put herself on the ground because she was too tired to be otherwise. She thought about how the most important thing that had ever happened to her in the field had happened when she stopped trying to be a field person and became just a person in a field. She picked up her camera from the table, the wide angle, the one she had brought from habit, the one she had carried out every morning hanging at her side. She turned it on and looked through the viewfinder at the wall of her apartment, and then lowered it and held it in her lap. She had been thinking about the photographs from the cabin, not about exhibiting them, not about publishing them. She was thinking about what they were. 4 months of a person with nowhere to be, in a place that allowed her to see with the patient attention that nowhere to be produces. The images were not technically exceptional. They were the work of someone who was present and paying attention. In her professional estimation, that was not always a small thing. She had one very specific thing she was thinking about: the fox. The young red fox who had appeared in 5 of her images near the tree line, who had also, she knew from the footage Carla had shared with her, appeared in several of M21's nights at the creek bank, pressed against his side in the cold. The fox had not been M21's story, exactly. She was her own story, a small life in the same landscape, making her own arrangements with whatever was there. But she had also been, in some way that resisted clean description, part of the texture of those 4 months, part of the fabric of the place. Nadia sat in her apartment in Denver and thought about the fox, and thought about M21, and thought about 2 hunted things in the same clearing, which was what Carla had said, and which was the most accurate single sentence she had encountered for what those months had been. And she thought about what she had said in response, which was, "I don't know if that makes it sadder or better." She had not arrived at an answer to that in the months since. She had accepted that it might not have one, that some true things were not resolvable into sad or better, but simply were what they were, true, and worth the knowing, and permanent in the way that real things are permanent once they have occurred. He had leaned into her palm, with 9 years behind him. That had happened. It was not reversible, and it was not transferable, and it was not something she could explain to someone who had not been there in a way that would fully carry it. It had happened, and she had been there, and it was hers, not as ownership but as memory, the kind that is part of you, and goes where you go, and changes how you see everything that comes after it. She put the camera down, and picked up the notebook, and opened it to the last written page, the last day she had counted. She looked at the number, and what was written under it, and read it once. Then she turned to the next blank page and picked up a pen, and wrote one thing, not dated, not numbered, just a sentence in the middle of the page. What it taught me is this: you do not always need to seek the extraordinary. Sometimes you only need to stop performing the ordinary. She looked at what she had written. She left it there, closed the notebook, and put it back on the shelf. Outside the window of her Denver apartment, the January morning was doing what January mornings do in a city, going about its business, indifferent and ordinary, and full of the small movements of people and light, and the low sounds of a place that never stops entirely. She looked out at it for a while. Then she picked up the camera and went out into it. She had no particular plan for the morning. She was going to walk for a while and see what was there, which was all she had ever really done in that place either, and which was, she now understood, not a small thing to know how to do. She walked out of her building into the January cold, and she walked. She was not looking for anything. She had learned, conclusively, and in the most specific classroom imaginable, what happened when you approached a day without looking for something in it. You became available to what was there, to whatever, in the morning's ordinary and unspecial fabric, was watching you from the trees, and deciding whether you were carrying anything toward it, and finding that you were not, and stepping out. She walked. The camera hung at her side. The city went about its business around her. And somewhere behind her, and in front of her, and in the particular January light falling on the ordinary street, things were deciding whether to show themselves. She was ready. She was ready in the only way that actually worked, without trying to be. She walked on. Owen Marsh drove his routes in the valley through the rest of that winter, and into the spring, and he checked his cameras and filed his reports, and walked his trails and did the work he had always done. He did not look for M21 at the creek bank, because there was no longer anything to find there, but he stopped at the bank on his rounds, the way you stop at a place that has become significant to you, not from habit exactly, but from a kind of ongoing acknowledgement that this place is not the same as the other places because of what happened here. He had his own copy of the footage from the summer before M21 died, the April morning footage. the 11 minutes of two beings sitting in the path in the clear light. He watched it sometimes in the evenings, not sentimentally, not because he needed to relive it, but because it was the best document he had, of something that was worth documenting, and he wanted to keep it fresh in himself. He thought about it on the drives, the long straight valley road with the mountains on either side. He thought about what it took to produce that footage, not technique, not training, 11 years of patience from his own side, 52 mornings of simple presence from Nadia's, 9 years of survival from M21's, all of it together, unrepeatable, arriving at an April morning in a clearing where nothing was asked of anyone and everything was given. He thought, that is what it looks like when something long and difficult resolves into something simple. He thought, it does not look like victory. It looks like two people sitting 8 feet apart and looking at different things and being fine. He drove through the spring valley, and the mountains were the mountains, and the forest was the forest, and the creek was running clear and fast in the thaw, and the camera on the bank was still there, still recording, still documenting whatever moved through the frame at whatever hour it arrived. He would keep the camera there, he would keep checking it, he would keep his log. Not because M21 was there anymore, but because something might be. Something was always moving through any landscape that had been lived in long enough. Something was always watching, and being watched, and deciding, in the long unhurried process that all living things share, what it was willing to let come close. You kept your camera running, you kept your routes, you kept showing up in the morning, with nothing particular to prove. And sometimes, if the conditions were right, and the timing was what it needed to be, and the right two beings happened to arrive in the same clearing at the same moment, with nothing between them but the cold morning air, something extraordinary happened. And then it was over. And then you got back in the truck and drove your next route. And you were different for it, quietly and permanently, in the way that everything that is real makes you different. Not loudly, not in ways that are easy to explain, just different, just changed, just carrying something that was not in you before, that belongs to you now, in the way that only the things that have actually happened to you can belong to you. Owen drove his route. The mountains were on either side, and the sky above was very blue, and the morning was cold and good. He drove, and he was different, and he was grateful, and the road was long and straight, and went all the way to the horizon.